Hello, and welcome to the final episode of the biology section of general science. Today we're going to be talking about evolution, and I'll be using a PowerPoint used by the University of Bristol. They have it available online, and it's a really good PowerPoint, so I'm going to use it to kind of outline my thoughts on the subject, because otherwise I get a little rambly when I talk about this, because I think it's important. After this, of course, we'll be moving on to another science. We'll move on to chemistry. But until then, let's get evolution, the discussion about that, right on going. So here we go, evolution. Okay, the tree of life is kind of the way that scientists think about how evolution, think about how life has grown, and it says that all living things share a common ancestor. And that basically means that we can draw a tree of life that goes all the way back to this common ancestor. So if you start down at the trunk, that would be our common ancestor, and as we go up, branches come off, showing different groups of animals and branches of change in the kingdoms of life. Okay, evolution is just the process by which one species ends up giving rise to another, and the tree of life grows. Evolution is all about change. It basically means that life on Earth has not been the same through its entirety. It has changed over time. And I'm going to try to present to you some evidence to show that that's the case. So let's get started. Okay, evolution is both a theory and a fact. Okay, confusion sometimes arises as to whether evolution is a theory or a fact, and it's both. Okay, the theory of evolution deals with how evolution happens, and our understanding of this process has been changing constantly since we really kind of figured out that that's what was happening. Remember, in science, a theory is something that some sort of thing that we've got a lot of data to back up. Remember, gravity is a theory. Okay, right? It's called the theory of gravity, not the fact of gravity. So the fact that it's called the theory of evolution does not make it something that we've just made up, right? It means that there's a lot of data to support it. And like I said, right? That means it's also a fact, and there's a lot of indisputable evidence to show that that's the process in which life on Earth has changed. Okay, those are the things we're going to talk about. How is evolution discovered? How does evolutionary work? And then what's some evidence? So we're going to get to see a lot of different things, and learn a lot about kind of the process of how we've come to this conclusion. Okay, the very beginning. Okay, we from classical times until about long after the Renaissance, right? Species were considered to be special creations. They were fixed for all time, right? They were divinely created by God. Here's Michelangelo's fresco on the Sistine Chapel. Great painting. Must have been incredibly difficult for him to do, because I can barely paint on paper, and he's like painting the ceiling. Anyway, around 1800, scientists began to wonder whether species could actually end up changing, or what they called transmute. And so this scientist named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck thought that if an animal acquired a characteristic during its lifetime, it could pass it on to its offspring. So basically, like, that was a way for him to explain that giraffes got their long necks through generations of straining to reach high branches. So they're saying that, like, the more you strain, the more the neck of the giraffe would grow, and eventually giraffes had really long necks. An interesting theory. Well, then, about the same time, certain geologists like William Smith were mapping the rocks and fossils of Britain, because that's just where a lot of these scientists were, and they were in England, so they were doing, a map of England. And he and others showed that different species existed in the past compared to today. So they were finding all these fossils that were different than the animals that were around right now, which at this point was a huge discovery. So we're talking about the 1800s, right? Only 200 years ago, we're just starting to find out about dinosaurs and these ancient animals that we had no idea existed prior till then. So of course it made sense that we all thought, oh yeah, of course all the animals that we know have been around since forever, because those are the only animals we knew about. But all of a sudden now we're learning about these animals that we didn't know existed because they were around before we were. And so then, about a little bit later than that, Charles Darwin, from 1831 to 1836, um, toured the world in the HMS Beagle, a ship provided by the Queen, and he was dazzled by the amazing diversity of life and kind of started to wonder how it might have originated. So that was kind of the big question on his mind as he was traveling around the world. And so, in his Origin of Species, which he published in 1859, Darwin proposed that one species may possibly give rise to another. And this is kind of how he explained that. He said, well, if food is limited, competition meant that only the fittest would survive, right? If you're living on a small island and the only thing to eat is coconuts, and there's 3 people on the island per se, right? The person who could best get the coconuts, open the coconuts, and eat the coconuts is the one who's going to survive the longest. Well, the same thing with all other animals, right? Right? If there's a limited amount of food, the ones that are able to get that food are going to be the ones that survive. And this would lead to what he called natural selection, which means the best adapted individuals and eventually the evolution of new species, right? The best adapted individuals are going to be the ones that can get their food and survive and reproduce and continue on. So Darwin's idea of natural selection was a huge controversy, and it's still a huge controversy today, right? We're still talking about it. And in 1860, just 1 year after he had published his work, there was a famous debate it was between a bishop and Darwin's leading kind of like attack dog, Thomas Henry Huxley. According to the people who were there, evolutionists had a much better job doing the debate, but few were actually convinced by Darwin's ideas. So it seems that in that particular instance, right, the evolutionists won the debate, but people weren't really convinced of what they were talking about. They agreed that Huxley was a better debater, but they didn't actually agree necessarily with the ideas that Huxley was talking about. Then, around the same time that Darwin was really coming up with all these theories, these thoughts about natural selection, there was a monk who I've talked about in previous episodes, right? Gregor Mendel. He was doing all of his work with pea plants, and he was figuring out the basics for genetic inheritance at the same time. Now, unfortunately, his work wasn't actually really looked at until much later. So by the early 20th century, scientists had started to kind of make sense about how this would work. Building on Mendel's genetics, studies showed that characteristics in a population could be selected by environmental pressures. This is basically the idea that, right, in Mendel's work, he talked about how if you had 2 different traits, one would be picked based on genetic probability. Well, let's say that in this case, instead of it being about a flower's color, what if it was about beak length, right? And you're a bird and you need to be able to get a certain food that's trapped inside this flower. And if your beak is longer, it's easier for you to get the food in the flower. Well, birds that have longer beaks, whether that's genetically random or not, they're going to be able to get more food, survive, and have more offspring, potentially producing more long-beaked birds than their short bird counterparts. And so over time and generation, those birds, they're going to be more and more longer beaks. That's what he means by an environmental pressure. Okay? The scarcity of food, competition for that, is going to favor certain traits that give you an advantage to get that food. This is what's called a modern synthesis. Julian Huxley brought Darwin's natural selection back into the center of evolutionary theory by combining it with genetics. Now, obviously, there's been some opposition to this. And so, although the majority of the scientific community believes that evolution is the way things work, many Christian groups have continued to oppose this concept. Even in 1925, right, the teaching of evolution was outlawed in Tennessee, and that resulted in the Scopes monkey trial, if you remember that one, if you remember that from your history class, right? And even today, there's still debate about it. There are certain states that have outlawed the teaching of evolution in their schools, so it's still something that's being talked about. Right, we're going to skip that part. So now, how does this all work? Okay, the mechanism of evolution is all in the genes. The genetic makeup of an organism is a genotype. We've talked about that before. And the genotype and the environment in which it lives determines its phenotype. So what you actually look like, the actual traits expressed. Okay, and the mechanism of that is DNA. Okay, the double helix structure of DNA was discovered in 1953, and this showed how genetic information is transferred from one cell to another with almost no error. So it replicates almost perfectly. Okay, there's Watson and Crick. Remember, they're not the greatest guys, right? They kind of shafted Rosalind Franklin, who did a lot of the work to help them figure this out. They won a Nobel Prize. She didn't. Now, of course, every once in a while, right, there are some copying errors that can occur when DNA is replicated, and those are called mutations. And mutations can be caused by radiation, they can be caused by viruses or carcinogens, okay? But these mutations are rare and they often have damaging effects. And so consequently, the organisms have special enzymes who repair faulty DNA. Here we have an example of a fruit fly that has a mutation, right? It has a red eye instead of a white one. So that was a mutation. Okay. Now, because of the way our DNA works and how genetics works, there's a lot of variation, okay, between a population, right? We can think about that just even with natural hair color, right? Some mutations will persist and increase genetic variation. And those variants of a particular gene are known as alleles, right? And that's why there are so many different natural hair colors. And these are just for the genes for the brown-blonde alleles. Like, see, there's so many different options, right, of natural hair colors. So clearly, right, there's variation is a part of genetics. So now natural selection steps in then and says that these mutant alleles can spread through the population via sexual reproduction. And if an allele exerts a harmful effect, it's going to reduce the ability of an individual to reproduce. And that allele will end up probably being removed from the population over time. But in contrast, mutants with favorable effects are preferentially passed on. So here we have an example here. So let's say there's a selection for darker hair, and you live in maybe like a forest where having darker hair would make it harder for you to be spotted by prey or predators, right? If a gray whatever animal this is, right, has a white child, a gray child, and a darker haired child, right, the darker animals are going to survive and reproduce more because they're not going to get killed off by the predators in their area. And so you're going to end up having more darker haired animals overall because the light haired ones are not going to live as long. That's how natural selection works, right? Genes that are alleles that are favorable are going to continue to pass on because the people or animals who have those genes are going to survive longer and actually pass the gene on. Okay. Here's another example of the peppered moth. It's an example of a natural selection in action, and it was discovered by this guy named Haldane. Okay. So during the Industrial Revolution, the trees on which this moth rested became soot covered. So as you can see, there are two different types of peppered moths. There's white with these black peppery spots, which is why they're called peppered moth, and then there's this black variation. Okay. The moths that were black prior to the Industrial Revolution had a hard time getting around because they were attacked by their predators. They were easy to spot because they were on these white trees. Well, when the trees became soot covered, it became very advantageous to be black when you're a peppered moth because then you could be camouflaged. And these white peppered moths, right, they became easily eatable by predators. And so now there's way more dark colored pepper moths than there are white pepper moths because of the trees. Another example is of microevolution. Dogs are an example of how the selection of traits can change the frequency of alleles. Dogs, we artificially select for certain characteristics, and that's why there are so many different breeds with different alleles for dogs, right? They're all dogs, they're all the same species, okay? However, they're different breeds because we've artificially selected certain traits for them. Basically, we've taken over the natural selection part of science, and instead we're doing it for the dogs. We're deciding who they breed with, and therefore we're getting special traits. The same thing happens with horses. Horse traits have been artificially selected for, and that's why certain breeds of horses are better for racing or jumping or whatever, right? And then we call that a microevolution. Now on the macro scale, we have the same kind of thing, except we get new species out of it. Okay, so when Darwin was traveling around, he ended up going to the Galapagos Islands, which a lot of people would know that that's where he went, and those are near Argentina. And if two populations of a species become isolated from one another for tens of thousands of years, their genetic differences may become marked. They might become so different that they become a different species. And so these populations, right, could no longer then interbreed and a new species is born. That's the definition of a species, that it can't interbreed with another group of animals that are similar. Okay, so these finches, they can't actually breed with each other, despite the fact that they're all finches. Okay, and these 4 different finches, right, are all different because they lived on different islands in the Galapagos, right? One had this big, thick beak because their food was harder to get through, and this one was smaller, and this one's even smaller, and this one's more of like a traditional bird beak, right? Because their food choices are different, and so their beaks had to be different, and they ended up becoming separate species of finches. That's macroevolution, evolution on a big scale, creating new species. So let's talk about some speciation issues today. Okay, the mosquito, okay, was introduced into the London Underground during its construction around 1900, and it became infamous in the war for attacking people sheltering during the Blitz. And studies have indicated that several genetic differences from its above-ground ancestors have created a new species of mosquito. It's called the London Underground mosquito, and they specifically live in the London Underground. And it's possible, right, that there's going to be a new species. They're not quite there yet, but they're having trouble interbreeding, making it seem that this is going to become a speciation, and we're going to have a new species of mosquito because of human interaction, right? We introduced mosquitoes into this environment, and now they're becoming different enough genetically to become a new species, and that was only 120 years ago. So that's a pretty quick turnaround, right? Showing that it can happen. All right. So evidence. Why do we think this is the case, right? We can't just say that this is it. We have to have some evidence to back it up. The first evidence is biochemistry. Okay. There's a basic similarity between all living things in our DNA, which suggests that we must have come from one single common ancestor, right? The same building blocks, the same general structure. All living things are passing on their information with this one type of molecule, DNA, which is structured the same, regardless of what animal or living thing you're looking at. All living things also use the molecule ATP to carry energy around the organism, which is another similarity that all living things have. Plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, all things use these 2 structures, these 2 functions to support their own life. So that's some biochemistry evidence for evolution. We also have a lot of similar genetics. Okay, the genetic codes of chimps and gorillas is almost identical to humans. It's only slightly different. Okay, if evolution is true, then we might also expect that closely related organisms will be more similar to one another than more distantly related organisms, and that has been shown to be true for the most part. If you compare human genetic code with that of other organisms, that shows that chimpanzees are nearly genetically identical. They differ by less than 1.2%. Whereas we're 15% genetically different from a mouse, right? And we're very different animals. So we're less related to mice than we are to chimpanzees. We also use something called comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is the idea of just comparing different species to each other and seeing the anatomical differences. Right here on the left, we have a picture of a human and a gorilla, and they're very similar, which suggests that they share a recent common ancestor, right? You can see it in a lot of different things here, and we're very different than something like, let's say, a woodlouse, right? But we do have a common characteristic. We have bilateral symmetry, right? We're the same on each side. Same thing here, right? And if you look at these, look at the bone structure, right? We are different, right? They have much bigger hips, their legs are a lot longer or shorter, their arms are longer, but the general structure, the general bone structure is similar, right? We have the same general pieces. We've got shoulder blades, we've got a rib cage, we have a pelvis, we've got legs attached to the pelvis in the same kind of way, right? It shows that there are some similarities between humans and gorillas. Homology is the idea that we can look at different things that have been modified in different animals, right? The pentadactyl limb is ancestral to all vertebrates. Every vertebrate, including us, has a pentadactyl limb, and that means we have 5 fingers. And here are a lot of different examples of the pentadactyl limb. We've got a bat. Bat wings are pentadactyl limbs. They have 5 fingers on them, right? And they're used for flight. Dolphins in their fins have 5 pentadactyl phalanges. The anteaters have 5 pentadactyl phalanges. The mole has 5. The horse, the pig, even the monkey, and us all have 5-fingered pentadactyl limbs, right? All vertebrates have it. It's a trait that all of us use, and we use it for different things. We use it for grabbing things and holding stuff. Horses use it to run really fast. Moles use it for digging. Dolphins use it to swim, and bats use it to fly, right? All these different things are used by the same type of trait. Another thing is what's called a vestigial structure, okay? A vestigial structure is something that as evolution progresses, some structures get sidelined and they no longer get used, okay? The coccyx is a much reduced version of an ancestral tail. That's the part at the end of your tailbone, right? Generally, right, our ancestors, which are more like chimpanzees and gorillas, they had tails that helped them balance and climb, right? However, we don't need that sort of thing because we're land-walking creatures. We don't climb in trees, and so we don't need a tail. And so now the ending of it is still there. It's still part of our spine, right? Another vestigial structure in the humans is the appendix. We don't necessarily 100% know what the appendix was for, but we still have it, right? And it's no longer used. So that's shown that even just in our time as humans, as Homo sapiens, our bodies have been changing, right? We no longer need this organ, but we still have it. The next thing we've got is the fossil record. The fossil record shows a sequence from simple bacteria all the way to the most complicated organisms, and it's a very compelling evidence for evolution. Now, is the fossil record complete? No, it is not. We do not have a fossil that shows every single animal that's ever existed from bacteria to human beings. But we do have enough fossils to show that there's definitely been a change from step to step to step. Missing a few pieces in the middle does not mean that the whole puzzle's not there, right? If you have a huge jigsaw puzzle and you're missing 2 or 3 pieces, you can still figure out what the picture is. We've figured out the picture even though we're missing a few pieces. We found a lot of things that are called transitional fossils, and these fossils show clear transitions from one species to another. A famous one is the Archaeopteryx, which was found in Germany, and it shares many characteristics with both dinosaurs and birds. And we know that birds did come from dinosaurs. Okay, so the Archaeopteryx here, that is one of the first transitional species between dinosaurs and birds. Here we've got the wing structures. This is where its head was, and here are its legs. Okay, and this is showing that it did have some sort of feathery structure, right? So it did have some kind of wings. We also have geography to help us out here. Geographic spread of organisms also tells of their past evolution. Marsupials occur in only 2 places nowadays, in the Americas and in Australia, which are on completely different sides of the planet from each other. And this shows that the group evolved before the continents drifted apart. So they were together in this area and they had evolved to this point, and then when they split apart, right, they had already evolved into marsupials. So that gives us more evidence of when the changes occurred based on geography and our understanding of plate tectonics. And then finally, antibiotic resistance is also a way that we can track natural selection. We're all familiar with the way that certain bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics, right? Staph infections are one of the ones that is one of the ones that we're facing with now, right? These megabugs that we can't cure with the stuff that we have because we've created these antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Well, this is an example of natural selection in action. The antibiotic acts as an environmental pressure, weeds out the bacteria with low resistance, and then only those with high resistance survive to reproduce, therefore creating a strain of bacteria that is extremely resistant, right, to antibiotics, which has become an issue for us. We don't want people to get this kind of staph infection because we can't treat it. So like I said, there's a lot of different evidence that points to there being evolution, okay? And the scientific community is very, very sure that this is how it works. Now, is it possible we're wrong? Sure, it's possible. But until someone gives us evidence to the contrary that goes against all the evidence that we've come up with, we're not going to change our minds. That's how science works. If we got enough evidence to overturn this and come up with some new idea of how life has changed on Earth, then we'll do that. But until we're presented with that evidence, we're not changing our minds. It's just the way it works. Sorry. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video and learning about evolution. Thank you so much for watching this series about general science. And in the next episode, we're going to transition to a new science. We're going to talk about chemistry next. Chemistry is what I have my degree in. I know a lot about it. I'm very excited to share that with you. Have a great day. Thank you so much for watching.